Come on. I'll show you. 15 seconds, I'll show you. 17 seconds. Reanimation at 17 seconds. The eyes open. Dr. Halsey, you once did me a favor by letting me into your medical school. Doctor, I'll come back to life.
That the only thing we have to fear is itself.
No. Be afraid. Be very afraid.
There's nothing to fear except God. Whatever that means to you.
Do I look like someone who cares what God thinks? Why do I say this? Because we got Holy Ghost time!
You're listening to The Fear of God, a podcast exploring the intersection between Christianity and the horror genre. Hello and welcome to The Fear of God, episode 27. We are having a conversation about the intersection between Christianity and the horror genre. And having that conversation is myself, Reed Lackey.
And myself, Nathan Rouse.
Last week, we dove for quite a while into a number of things, primarily centered around 1931's Frankenstein. And as we have done with each of these, with Dracula last month, and as we're going to be doing with any of these Universal monster films, we're going to look at the film itself and then look at a more recent version of something exploring the same themes. So today, I chose a film to companion to Frankenstein that listeners, if you watched it, I apologize. I don't know, maybe you loved it. There's a lot of fans of this film. I'm one of them. I'm a fan of this film. But we chose to discuss 1985's Stuart Gordon directed Re-Animator, a true classic in the horror genre. I'm not being facetious or sarcastic when I say that. It really is a horror classic, but a very particular kind of horror classic, and I'm sure we'll be talking about that. But before we get into that, Nathan, how are you doing? How is everything?
I'm good. I'm here. I'm ready to get kind of ahead of the game, if you will.
I see what you did there.
I feel like there's another joke to be made there.
Well, you could always go with the tagline on the movie poster, which says, Herbert West has a good head on his shoulders and one on his desk.
Wow. All right. Well, there you go. There you go.
Before we go into Re-Animator specifically, I want to mention something that is also, so if people watched this film, this is an absurdly gory film. It is ridiculously gory, lots of blood, lots of disembodiments, lots of disembowelments. I mean, just lots of body stuff to be had. Another bit of gory entertainment that I've recently been quite delighted by is the new Netflix original series called Santa Clarita Diet. Now, listeners, you may or may not know this, but I reside in the town of Santa Clarita.
And are on a diet.
And I am on a diet, as a matter of fact. That is not true. But I reside in Santa Clarita. In fact, there was a scene in the first episode of this new Netflix original show that was filmed right next to our house. It's pretty wild, actually. But that show, is very...
So did you...
Very outrageous.
Did you know the shooting was happening, or did you happen to watch the show and then we're like, oh, that's right next to us?
Yep. We happened to watch the show, and there's a supermarket right next door to our apartment with a little strip mall of different stores and a very specific lineup.
I've been there.
It is a very recognizable parking lot, and one of the scenes in the episode takes place right in that parking lot, which is it was very fun. It was weird enough seeing the name of our town in the show, but then the show itself is even weirder. I don't want to spoil particulars about the show because, listeners, it's available on Netflix, and I think you should check it out. Just be mindful that it's very gory and it is got a lot of foul language in it as well. But I think it's a very fun show.
That must be fun. I mean, the only time I've seen my town in headlines in the last 6 months or so was race riots. So,
Yeah, not quite as enjoyable or entertaining.
No, definitely not.
But
hey,
no,
I'm gonna recommend something.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So this is not a book or a movie or anything, but it is something that I think our audience would be, and you. This is what off air I would say. Hey, Reed, you ought to check this out. So we on the show tend to skirt up to and or sometimes just jump in the pool of what it means to be a person of faith in our current society. Mm-hmm. There's a podcast, On Being, anyone who sort of has some awareness of kind of the NPR circuit of shows would be aware of that one. But someone just tipped me off to this one from 2008, which, while 8 years ago, is still incredibly applicable today, though it would be interesting to hear these same guys talk about our current scenario. But she interviews Chuck Colson, Shane Claiborne, and Greg Boyd. Those names
are all
mean, yeah. And this is an unedited, I think they've just released the unedited version because of the timeliness of the content. But it's about an hour and a half, and it's the three of them engaging all sorts of issues as they relate specifically to life as a Christian in America. It's incredibly powerful. It's just it's a good listen. It really will help you put some language perhaps on some of the things you're thinking about, or at least hear some people in our world talk about the issues that matter to us. I highly recommend anybody listening to it.
Awesome.
To check it out.
Yeah, I'll have to do that. I enjoy to varying degrees all of those three people. They've all got very interesting things to say. And from very different elements of the spectrum.
Well, and that's one of the reasons for it. You've got Colson, who's kind of the old guard, as it were. You've got Greg Boyd, who's a more evangelical sort of pastor of a megachurch type of scenario. And then you've got Shane Claiborne, who is very much on more of the fringe left, if you will. So it's them. It's just them all engaging. The idea being we can all sort of be of one faith with varying perspectives on pertinent issues. Anyway,
thank you for that recommendation. I think I'm going to check that out probably as soon as we're done recording. And speaking of recording,
here we are.
So Nathan,
Reed,
I received from you as you were watching this film a number of texts that I can't say on this show. because this show by our standards is clean and is
sure.
as much as it can be when you're discussing films in the horror genre, a family appropriate show. So so I'm not able to share with listeners the delights of some of the texts that I received from you while you were
I know you're building to asking me how I enjoyed the movie, but how do you experience receiving those texts, which for the audience are littered with F-bombs, by the way. I have no shame. You drag me through the mud, I'm going to pull you back down with me.
F-bombs and at least one middle finger, which was a delight to receive.
That's what 15 going on, 2 decades of friendship can get you, everybody. If you stick with me long enough, you're going to get the middle finger in a text one day.
That's so true. It was fun because based on your texts, I knew exactly where you were in the movie. It was great. It was really great. To the
point that the last text I sent you was basically a eulogy of our friendship, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was a eulogy of our friendship and of our show, to the degree that I apologized to you the next day by text for having made you watch this movie. And I do think, listeners, that this may be the first official. I know that you did not love They Live, but you at least appreciated and respected They Live. Maybe you do this one as well. But I said this may be the first episode of Fear of God, 27 episodes in, that Nathan actively dislikes the movie that we're discussing. That may or may not be true, but
that's not too far off.
So yeah, Nathan, tell us about Re-Animator. What's Re-Animator like? What was your experience like of watching Re-Animate?
It'll grab you by the cranium and just rip. I knew nothing about this movie, but it's funny.
Yes, it is.
When we first, no, it really isn't. When we first started this journey of the fear of God together, I sort of thought, okay, there's this sort of category of horror movie. And I think, and this is as someone not entrenched in it. There's this category of horror movie, which is like that 80s it feels like 80s. As I considered it, it feels like the 80s, maybe somewhat in the 90s too, but this schlocky, gross, that USA late night in 1992 kind of movie. You know what I mean? Like, that kind of movie. So, up till now, we've walked a pretty high-minded tightrope, right? Like The Conjuring and The Conjuring 2 and Cloverfield Lane and these movies that have really interesting things to say.
And Sinister. And
wrapped in blood as they are.
Right.
I knew something about, I had no idea. I had not heard of this movie, but you're like Re-Animator. I'm like, oh, I was about to cuss just now. Oh no, something about that title. Then I go look at the cover art and I'm like, oh man.
Oh yeah.
Here we go. Like, so then I sat down last night and curled up and, I don't know. I had to make sure I told my wife, I was like, she was initially in the room and she usually avoids these things anyway. I said, I need you to leave. This is what I said to her. I said, I need you to leave the room because I have no idea what I'm about to watch. And I don't want to be accountable for your experience of this movie.
That was wise. That was really wise.
Yes.
Oh my!
So
because even in the opening scene, like the first scene, you see this guy's eyeballs pop out of his head, and his head like mostly explodes.
Whatever happens there.
Oh man!
Now hear me. Like, I would put They Live and Re-Animator in different categories. Although one of my first notes about this movie is it feels very. Here's this word again, Carpenterian. It has that feel to it. It's got kind of a vibe, a John Carpenter kind of vibe to it.
Interesting.
And maybe that's just the 80s synthesizer music coming through. I don't know. But
sensibilities, right.
I was a little bit enriched to see it was Lovecraft. Not that I know much about the Lovecraft material, but you see that name and you're like, okay, well, all right. I'm going to give this some rope here.
He's an icon in the horror genre. Like one of the upper tier icons. Yeah.
I do know King is, references Lovecraft a lot, and his book Revival specifically is kind of an homage to Lovecraftian horror.
Yeah, absolutely.
Here's the thing. I'll give Re-Animator some points for inventiveness, sincerely. Like, that's not me just trying to be, trying to find some diplomatic middle ground here. Like, like if you can sort of get past some of its excesses, and its excesses are excessive, but it's inventive because I actually thought about a third of the way through the movie once it becomes clear that West, right?
Herbert West.
Once it became clear that Herbert and Dan were going to team up, I was like, okay, well, where does the plot of this movie go then? Because there's still like an hour left. And then it starts to reveal itself.
Little did you know.
Oh, this is where the plot of the movie goes. To the dirtiest, dankest lab, science lab in the bottom barrel of hell. That's where this movie goes.
Oh my, yes it does. Yes it does.
So yeah. I mean, it was an interesting ride. I don't really plan on watching it again anytime soon. Maybe ever. But who knows? Maybe one day you and I will be hanging out and we're like, let's pop Re-Animator in. I'll be like, all right, let's do it for Riri. Although I will say, one thing I did tweet you that was devoid of profanity was something we may consider for future with movies perhaps like this, is live tweeting them because, there could be some fun in just sort of watching someone else's experience of these movies.
Sure. I'd be all down for that. And yeah, it was wise not to begin that with Re-Animator, particularly with your, shall we say, colorful reactions to the film.
With all of our like 50 followers, we'd have cut them in half. Like, wow, I thought these guys were Christians.
Yeah, I know, right? It's funny because the first time that I saw Re-Animator, actually my nephew Landon, who he and I, anytime we have the opportunity to get together, we love horror movies, we love scary movies, and he actually was a really big fan of Re-Animator and I had never seen it at the time. So he had introduced me to that movie, and it was one where I knew like, okay, this is a blind spot for me in my horror lexicon. And it was funny because I saw it, and I was actually, the first time I saw it, I was a bit ambivalent towards it. I was a bit like, oh, it's all right. I just didn't quite know what to expect. And so I had seen it and I didn't dislike it. I certainly didn't actively dislike it the way that it seems that to a degree you do. But it was one of those things where I was just kind of more appreciative of what I thought it was kind of trying to do. When I rewatched it again and sort of tiered us towards talking about it for this episode, I appreciated it a lot more for what I think it's trying to do, because there's a very specific subset of the horror genre that it's been quite a few episodes before we've really talked about influences in the genre at large. And there is a subset in the horror genre of specifically kind of subversive, absurd, extreme, just almost silly levels of gore and silly levels of just absurd, horrendous things that, like, if you were to describe what was happening in Re-Animator and the person did not know how absurdly it's treated, you would think like, man, that's just, how can you even sit through something like that? That's just incredibly perverse, and that's just incredibly just disturbing and disgusting. And I'm not saying that Re-Animator is not disturbing and disgusting on its own, but it's played almost for as many laughs as it is for as many scares. Like, there's not that much actual scares in the film. It's specifically intended, like, it's supposed to look repulsive and it's supposed to look ridiculous. Like, there's a lot of those images that you're supposed to, it's supposed to be kind of darkly humorous in what it's doing. And I think that by doing that, the film is actually pretty successful at subverting a lot of your expectations as an audience member, subverting what you think is supposed to happen for these people and for these characters. Because if there's one thing that I think you've already attested to that you could say about Re-Animator, is that it is quite unexpected. I mean, it's loosely based on the Lovecraft story, which the full title of the Lovecraft story is Herbert West Re-Animator. It's loosely based on that story, but really only loosely based on like the first half of that story. That story goes to a variety of different places, and the similarities between that story and the movie end about halfway through the movie. Like that whole last section in the morgue with Dr. Hill and everything. Right. Not in the movie or not in the book at all. Not at all in the story.
Interesting.
So it's fascinating to me that it used this launch pad to talk about, and I do think that there's some interesting things thematically going into it that I'm sure we'll get into, but I just want to kind of start with likes, dislikes, and I'll go ahead and lead the charge because I'm sure you won't have many. But I will say that two small trivial bits that listeners may or may not pick up on. Near the beginning of the movie, in Dan Kane's wall in his room, there's a poster. And if you don't at all know this poster, and if you don't at all know this musical band, this won't mean anything to you, but there's a poster for an album called Stop Making Sense, and the name of the band is Talking Heads, which I think is amazing. I
did catch the Talking Heads poster, but it would not have at that point made any sense to me, the connection there.
That's true. The other thing, sort of music related.
Okay, my opinion has completely changed about the movie.
There it is. I knew it would just take one little trigger, and then there you go.
Right.
One thing that I actually wrote this down when we discussed Carrie, and I neglected to mention it, so I'll mention it now and mention it about this film. So in the movie Carrie, several times throughout the film, there is a shrill sound used as part of the musical score that is actually directly from Bernard Herrmann's score for Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. From the shower scene specifically, the eek, eek, like that's used several times in the film Carrie. The reason it was used in Carrie is because Bernard Herrmann was originally supposed to score Carrie, but he passed away before the film was completed. So instead, as kind of an homage to him, they included that segment of the Psycho score in that. The reason I bring it up for Re-Animator is because Re-Animator heavily borrows, almost to the point where it has been accused of outright plagiarism. Heavily borrows from the score to Psycho, the extended score to Psycho. It takes the score to Psycho, Bernard Herrmann's score, and adds layers of electronic synthesizer things underneath it. But the musical melody and rhythm is very much Psycho's score.
So basically, they were just like paging Mr. Herrmann. Mr. Herrmann, you have a
yes. As a matter of fact,
you have a call at the front desk. I love, this is why we're friends, Reed, that I can make that reference and I don't even have to fill it out. You just start laughing. Like, that's magic. That's that's friendship, everybody.
But yeah, I mean, I mean, those are just a couple of, quick trivial bits, as it were, but,
I can come up with some trivial bits.
Oh, go ahead.
Which sounds like a cereal or a Chef Boyardee thing. Here's your trivial bits. Do you want milk with your trivial bits?
Wow. Trivial bits are for kids.
So one, I'll make this reference. I don't know if you'll get it or not, but like Rufus is classic Toonces. Toonces the cat. This is Saturday Night Live. We will put this on the Facebook page when this episode airs. All right. Toonces is the cat who could drive. And,
okay, I do not know this Saturday Night Live sketch.
Oh gosh, it's classic and beautiful. It's like Kevin Nealon era Saturday Night Live, awesome. Mike Myers era, and it's just they've got this little theme song. It's Toonces the cat, and he drives cars. But the gag is every sketch, the human that's riding with Toonces is like, oh, I was worried because you're a cat, but turns out you can drive. And then within seconds, Toonces drives them over a cliff. Like that's just the cat because he's a cat and cats can't drive. But Rufus just reminded me of the world of Toonces, and it made me smile a little bit until friggin' Dan slammed him into the wall like a friggin' basketball. Good grief. God, that was horrific.
How great was it when he walks in and Herbert West is like wrestling with this cat thing that's so clearly just been a dummy cat that's just affixed to his back. But Jeffrey Combs, the actor, is so committed to it. Like, and they've got the sound going, and it's outrageous. It's so great. And I love that line too, like after and this is what I mean about the film's dark humor. Like he's sitting there, he's like, well, you would agree the cat's dead now, right? And just like picks it up and plops it. And then when he reanimates him again, he's like, don't expect him to do the tango. He's got a broken back. But says it so directly and plays it so straight. The film, like I really more the second time around got into the dark humor of this film. Yeah. Like it's meant to be absurd.
Hear me. I'm not a hater completely. I could see room for that possibility. I will say the sort of the scene is a bit off-putting in a way that we should talk. Yeah, dampens that a little bit. But and heck, I even fast forwarded through it, and I still was like, oh no, I'm sad. We will definitely, in a much more serious tone, address this film's scene. I did write down, you referenced his name, Dr. Hill. I wrote down, did he not think through the ramifications of a headless existence? Like knowing what? Like, you gotta think about this stuff. You gotta, how are you gonna live past the morgue? What are you gonna do? How are you gonna have gainful employment? Like, what happens when you eat? It's just going to fall out the bottom of your head,
Well, yeah, that's the thing. No, evidently, this disembodied head can speak without lungs. Evidently, it can,
but see, here's where two guys with theater degrees get into a conversation about science. Do you need lungs to speak? I don't think so. I thought this, do you need like vocal cords? You need lungs to breathe.
But the air to push through the vocal cords has got to come from somewhere. It's got to come from somewhere. You can't just try saying something and not breathe. Right now, try saying anything without breathing. Well,
last week we talked about staying curious and being open to mystery, and this is it. We don't know.
I'm very curious if you can talk without breathing, Nathan. I'm very curious.
I'm not going to attempt it. I'm simply saying, but you're proving my point. He is a scientist, and he didn't think through the ramifications of a headless existence. What? Yeah. He's just gonna be carried around for a while. Like that's your life.
Evidently he can speak without lungs, and evidently his decapitated body can navigate deftly with the eyes sitting in a doctor's bag. He sneaks around.
Now I will say, I'll knock this movie points left and right, but that scene with the dummy head on top of the body. That was hysterical.
Oh man, it's so funny. It's so funny. I love that.
I couldn't help but laugh there.
I mean, there's a lot of really funny moments in this movie. I do think, one shot that I love, it's not a funny shot, but one shot that I just really adore is, actually the shot when he, is like through the two-way mirror. So Dr. Hill is holding his own head and talking to Dean Housley, if I'm saying his name correctly, but like, and the light is such that the heads sort of overlap one another. That's a great shot. That's a fantastic shot. I don't even think it means much in terms of theme or anything like that, but it's just a fantastic shot.
Well, it is impressive. What am I trying to say? The violence is so sudden in places and so over the top, but it still feels a little real, which makes it the grotesque, right? I mean, when naked bodybuilder reanimates and is just terrorizing the morgue, and then all of a sudden Halsey comes in and he's just slapping him around like a rag doll. You're like, holy cow, what is happening?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, and I think that's part of it. This whole like, the treatment of bodies, I think is very key to understanding the plot of the movie. Now, I will say, for me personally, there weren't really any scary moments, but there was one moment that I love so much from a horror perspective, from a jump moment perspective, just everything about it is unquestionably and undeniably my favorite moment in the movie. It is after Herbert West has come in, he and Kane are all there and they're about to have a confrontation with Dr. Hill, who at this point is decapitated and is holding his own head in his hands. And Herbert West says, I have big ideas about, how to use this serum. And then when Hill responds to him, in that very, I'm not going to mimic it, but, that very sort of ghastly voice, he says, "So do I." And at the moment he says, "So do I," every body bag in the room leaps up. And that's when like suddenly they're overwhelmed with all of these reanimated corpses. I love that moment so much. It's a great kind of jump moment. Even if you don't jump very much, it's a great sort of startle moment. You don't expect that to happen. And just from a horror movie perspective, I just think that's a fantastic moment that he's like, "Hey, I've got some ideas about what to do."
Tell me, because I never plan to watch it, unless you force me to. Clearly, what's the name of the actor who plays Herbert West?
Jeffrey Combs. Yeah.
Right. So he's in the second one. So what's the plot of the second one?
Second and the third one. Yeah. So the second and the third one, it basically picks up where this, takes off. Now, it's been years since I've seen it, but it takes up where this leaves off, and he actually reteams with Kane.
Right. But I mean, this movie leaves you in a place
wondering if he survives.
Right.
Yeah. No, he does. He survives. And they start going and basically robbing bodies, from actually the Peruvian Civil War. They start, right. I know, right? But they actually start robbing bodies and reanimating them. And, he also revives the body of Megan, or actually, if memory serves me correctly, now I did not rewatch this film in preparation for this, but if memory serves me correctly, what he actually does is reanimates the heart of Megan and puts it in a different body. I think it's a different actress, but he reanimates the heart of Megan and puts it in someone else, which is the bride of term, as it were. But basically they just continue to pursue that course of action of trying to reanimate dead corpses. Now Kane is much more on board with what's happening, and I think Dr. Hill even returns as the main antagonist for that movie again, played again by the actor whose name is David Gale. But yeah, I mean, my memory of Bride of Re-Animator and of Beyond Re-Animator is not as clear or as fond as my memory for the original Re-Animator. It was directed by the producer. Both of those films were directed by the producer, Brian Usna, if I'm saying his name correctly, which I'm probably not. But, I mean, I would have to actually rewatch them to have an accurate critical assessment, but my memory of Bride of Re-Animator and of Beyond Re-Animator is not kind. I don't remember liking them very much. And this keeping in mind that the first time I saw Re-Animator, I was only meh about it. I'm much more fond of it after a second viewing of it. But yeah, I was only sort of meh about it to begin with. But this holds a high place for a lot of people in the
Sure. I mean, it's on Rotten Tomatoes had like a 94%.
Yeah, it does.
Which just reinforces my desire to do a petition to Rotten Tomatoes to take it down, you know?
Because it's evidently so unfair.
I know, because it didn't, yeah. I mean, Batman Superman was the best movie of last year, and, you know, people, it tanked. I mean, what's up with Rotten Tomatoes?
I know Rotten Tomatoes. Rotten Tomatoes doesn't know quality.
I'm going to throw a Rotten Tomato at Rotten Tomatoes.
But I do want, real quickly, before we dive into theme, if any listeners out there, this is going to be a dramatic turn for the serious, so we'll probably keep it rather brief, but if listeners watched this film, and had never seen this film, I did warn you last episode that at times it was offensive. There's a scene in this movie of outright sexual assault. And it is uncomfortable, even as a scene in itself, made all the more so uncomfortable by the fact that the assailant is...
a disembodied head.
A disembodied head. So it is. Now, here's the thing. I want to be sensitive to this because there's lots of scenes in films that I would go to bat for. We talked about the scene in Bone Tomahawk. I would go to bat for that scene being as graphic as it is and being necessary to understanding that movie. I would go to bat for the crucifix scene in The Exorcist. I would go to bat for a number of very intense and potentially deeply offensive scenes in a number of films. I will confess that while I do think a couple of interesting things are going on in this scene in Re-Animator, I myself cannot find much defense for this scene in Re-Animator. I do think...
Because I was worried we'd diverge here a little bit.
I do think that it is scratching at a couple of interesting thematic elements. But I think that the way it plays out, it's interesting to note, and this is a rather tragic note, it's interesting to note that actor, again, his name's David Gale, he and his wife divorced shortly after the release of this film, and it was largely speculated by his friends and some of the cast members that it was because of that scene. And, you know, who knows how much of that is true, but yeah, I mean, it's pretty rough. There is a surprising, I'll even call it alarming, there is an alarming lack of commentary that I could find on the internet regarding that scene. There's not a lot of people calling attention to it, asking questions about why it's in there. There's not a lot of defense from it by Gordon's side or anything. There's an alarming lack of just acknowledgement of that scene and how potentially offensive that it is. And one thing that I will say and this bleeds into some of what I wanted to talk about thematically. I'll make just sort of this statement about that scene, that I do think that this is probably going to be a very heavy statement to make and then just sort of run with it because this is not what I wanted to focus on thematically. But I will say that when you view bodies, when you view people, when you view other people as nothing more than motor responses and tissue, when you view them as nothing more than animalistic, then it is very easy for violation to have no consequence to you. It's very easy for the concept of violating another person to be absent from you unless you see other people as other people. I do think that we could probably spend a lot of time that I actually don't want to spend necessarily exploring the fact that it is a disembodied head. You can talk a lot about, potential assailants and criminal assault. You basically only operating with a singular member of their body, and that there's no compassion, that there's no concern, and which is why it's such a heinous and horrific crime. And it is fascinating to me that what he says before he's about to do that thing is he tells her that he's always admired her. And I think that the film is probably trying to explore something about that hypocrisy and talking about how, people may, when they're trying to justify behaviors or justify the objectification of women, that they may be going into this sort of thing of like, well, no, it's It's an admiration. It's a compliment. It's a compliment to talk about you that way and to catcall you, which no, it's not. It couldn't be less of a worthy or valuable thing to treat other human beings, especially women, but other human beings in general, as just objects or just as, something for your own pleasure or for your own usage. Like there couldn't be something that's more offensive or upsetting to me in general to treat other people that way.
And I think if I can interject, like, since you had warned me about the scene and I kind of saved myself the trouble. And once I realized it was, happening, I just sort of fast forwarded through it and, but got kind of a gist. But it's made me think about, you just referenced Bone Tomahawk and, hear me, we're talking about Re-Animator. So it's part of the context. It's part of the content. We're going there. There's stuff to mine in terms of our typical conversations, but Bone Tomahawk is a good counterpoint to this because even independent of Re-Animator, like before we even went this direction, before I watched that movie, I thought about Bone Tomahawk's violence and that particular scene there and how you could make a case, and I think there's an argument to be made about the quote unquote necessity. But what matters is intent, right? And
right.
And in Bone Tomahawk, there's nothing about that movie of which the intention is to violate or deface. And the reason I can stand behind that statement is very specific to Bone Tomahawk, which is this scene is representative of other things that have happened off screen too, within the content of that movie. You referenced in our episode about Bone Tomahawk that David Arquette gets consumed off screen. He gets,
right.
Filleted and then devoured, but you never see it.
Right.
The point I'm simply trying to make is in Bone Tomahawk, that scene is meant to be a very illustrative point of these characters recognizing the potential for their own fate.
Right.
It's the intention of the movie is not to violate or desecrate. It is hard to not make that case in this movie,
Right.
There's a sense in which you would watch this and be like, oh, wow, you guys were living it up in the 80s and all about titillation and, you end up with a scene as sort of grotesque and macabre as this one, yeah, it's worth the skipping. I think we're both giving a very long-winded way to say, at the certain point, once you realize this is happening, feel total freedom to just skip that moment.
Yeah, because it's terribly perverse. I don't use that word very often, but that scene is deliberately very, very perverse. And I will say, though I don't know how entertaining I would be to this notion, if there are any listeners out there who have a different take on that scene, I would happily listen to it. I think it would be an uphill battle to convince me of the scene's importance or necessity, but I would definitely invite any sort of conversation about anything that we've discussed here, particularly in that scene. But I do want to say, and this will hopefully segue us out, that I think that scene aside, that Re-Animator has a lot of things of value in it worth talking about. The inclusion of that scene is unfortunate because I think if that scene were not in it, it would be a lot easier to more wholeheartedly sort of embrace the film and what it's exploring and how it's exploring it. That scene does inhibit that to a great degree. But I do think it's interesting, this is the companion film to our discussion about Frankenstein last week. And it was fascinating to me that both of those films, to a degree, are trying to examine in very different ways, but trying to examine the conquering of death, the defeat of death, as it were, to where there's not the illusions in Re-Animator of someone playing God. But what's fascinating to me, sort of as my first thematic interjection, what's fascinating to me is that in this movie, Herbert West, the character, our main character, which it could be argued that in this film, Dan Kane is actually our main character, but Herbert West is the Re-Animator of the title, and it could be argued that he wants to conquer death. But what's interesting is that Dr. Hill, who eventually becomes that disembodied head, he wants to conquer the will. So I thought that was fascinating that West wants to simply revive the dead, but Hill wants to control the living and the dead. And both of those intentions hold a great deal of folly in even their attempt to try to do such a thing. And both of those characters in this film, if this film was all we had, if we didn't have Bride of Re-Animator where the characters come back, if we didn't have anything, at the end of this film, it is left to believe that both Herbert West and Dr. Hill are done for, that they are broken by their own efforts to control both the body and the will. And it was fascinating to me that it was basically a futile endeavor on both of their part. Both of them are leaning upon their own capacity, their own knowledge, their own understanding, their own control to try to basically manipulate life and death. And I do think that in our own ways, there's an element to each and every one of us which probably feels like we can do that. I think that I'll say this about the will. This is what stuck out to me about Dr. Hill's case, is when you think about things like abusive situations, when you think about things like advertising, let's go less severe and less heavy-handed. Think about advertising and think about ways that you can subtly manipulate and convince someone to do something that you want them to do, and in essence kind of control them or coerce them in such a way to act as if you would, or how you would want them to act. It's interesting to me how infrequently we talk about the sin of manipulation. It's interesting to me how infrequently we talk about, we certainly beat up the church quite a bit, last week. Well, maybe we didn't really beat up the church, but maybe just sort of came to the defense of the real church. But, I think that even from the pulpit, or from any lectern, within the church or without the church, like, we don't talk very much about what I would deem, quote unquote, the sin of manipulation. But that's something that I think is present in this film, most specifically in the character of Dr. Hill. And his work is all revolving around controlling the living and the dead. And at first he succeeds in doing that with Dean Housley and his reanimated body. But then Housley, in I think a pivotal moment, turns on him and begins to, and he actually destroys Dr. Hill in general, squeezes his head like a ripe melon. But I would invite any or all thoughts that you had on this notion of what I would call the sin of manipulation and the folly of committing that sin, believing we do so with impunity.
Yeah. I mean, I think partly because what it feels like you're brushing up against there is sometimes harder to outright see, you know, like if you are a manipulator, you just think, well, this is just who I am and how I behave. If you're someone who is being manipulated, it's sometimes hard to discern that that's happening in the moment. So I'd say that's one thing. And the other thing is almost all of us do this to a certain degree. And so, you know, it's the age old adage, well, like, why does the pastor keep beating up on homosexuality? Well, it's because he can never envision himself being that way. Like, it's easy to beat up on something that you just aren't, if you aren't. You know, like, we get real sensitive when you start tapping on the bruise of things that we actually succumb to and fall prey to in our own life.
Yeah.
You know, so, yeah, sometimes it is hard to just not sort of want to wash your hands of sin of gossip or sin of slander or sin of this or sin of that, you know, but we kind of keep coming back to it. I feel like I'm really wandering far afield of what you're interested in actually talking about, but I do think there's value in what you're saying in the sense that it's so easy to overlook these things in ourselves.
Right.
You know, the subtle ways that self-seeking grows in us. And, you know, your explicit example of manipulation being one of those. Like, how many different ways in a given day do we execute behaviors or interact with other people that are really just efforts to further our own designs down the road?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Right. Oh, yeah.
And I think, I think that's definitely worthy to talk about. And, you know, you have something like Re-Animator where this is sort of, a heightened version of that, and someone like Dr. Hill. But we just have to be careful that we aren't falling prey to just using people around us as bodies, as just,
yes, right.
Just cogs in our own machine of life.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a very astute observation that we'd do well to pay mind to, because it's so easy. And I think you might resonate with this. Like, it's so easy to just kind of coast through your life being like, I'm good, not as in like, I don't occasionally fall prey to a sin here or there or whatever, but we like to think better of ourselves than perhaps we really are. Yes,
we definitely do. And I think to what you were saying earlier about, or just a second ago, about us like using bodies, it does stand out to me that Herbert West cares nothing about any of these people. Cares nothing about them as people. He cares about the fact that he can, he said to Halsey, I actually really enjoy this line. He says to him, he said, you did me a favor by inviting me into your school. Welcome back to life.
Yeah. I wrote that down. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a great line. It's a really, really great line. And, it's one of those things where he cares so very little about the actual, it's not even life. It's an illusion of life. It is the title, which Lovecraft can be credited with, it's not resurrection. It's reanimation. Resurrection is a calling forth back into life. But reanimation is simply that. It is devoid of soul.
It's mechanics.
Absolutely. It's mechanics. It's absolutely just the motion of an organism. It is tissue that has motion. That's all it is to it. And it is seen as life. One of the things that I took note of that is really tragic, and in a film this absurd and in a film this darkly humorous, it's fascinating to me the note that it ends on, because the first time that we see the character of Dan Kane, first time we see him, he's trying to revive a patient using CPR. He's trying to revive someone who has deceased, and he fails at that attempt. And then, in the end, we see him doing that again for someone he loves and for someone he cares about. And I took specific note of the fact that the film begins and ends with him trying to revive a patient in the same exact way, in the same exact room. Like, he carries Megan back to the same room that we first meet him in and is trying to revive her by CPR. But when he fails at that, what does he resort to? When he fails at that, instead of accepting the reality and accepting the gravity of what he's been playing with and what he's become involved in, instead of accepting that reality, what does he resort to? And it's a tragic, but I think a brilliant final moment. He grabs the syringe of reanimation fluid. And what happens when we cannot accept listeners, this is a grandiose statement, and it's a broad statement, but it's one that I mean. What happens when we cannot accept the otherness of a person? What happens when we cannot accept the realities of life and death? What happens when we are in denial about our own limits of control, and when we are in denial about the things that we can no longer harness for our own purposes and intentions? We resort to manipulation. We resort to, I am going to use the tactics that will get me the end result that I want. And in this film, that is merely an illusion of life. It is not life.
Yeah.
That is not the actual goal that he would love to accomplish. That is merely an illusion. And that's what he resorts to when he cannot save these people. And I think we would do ourselves a service to recognize in our own choices and in our own lives where the people around us have become just means to an end. Where they've just become means to our own success or our own advancement. And when we stop seeing them as flesh and blood, living human beings, living souls. C.S. Lewis, and I'm not going to derail us into a theological conversation about whether or not this is fully correct in its expression, but he says, we are not bodies that have a soul. We are souls that have a body. And talking about the identity of a human frame. And I think that regardless of how people may feel about that statement or whether that statement's accurate or not, I do think that it's true that when you begin to see the other as we said, nothing more than a means to an end, then you're going to lose control very quickly. Things are going to get out of hand rapidly, and you will have almost no choice but to either surrender to the reality of your situation and face the consequences of it and pay the penance for those consequences, or resort to manipulation to foster an illusion of what you really want rather than the substance of what you really want.
Sure,
I hope that all makes sense.
Yeah. And it's funny. You're making me think of, believe it or not, of like marriage, and I think how like, and hear me, marriage as simply, a template for intimate relationship. Like I feel like one of the greatest lessons I've ever had to learn, and it was a lesson learned the hard way, as most, true and good ones are, is like this person in your life is not, let's use the language here, is not an animatronic. It's not just a person to sort of cater to your wants and desires, which sounds like I mean like in a sexual way. That's not at all what I mean. I just mean like in a life way, like doing whatever you want, whenever you want kind of thing. Like, this person is a conscious person with an essence and with as much and as high a level of desire and ambition and need for support and comfort and safety as you are.
Right.
And to somehow forget that or somehow neglect that, you start to run this severe risk of turning them into, just as you've described, that animation, that just, tissue given motion.
Right.
They become just part of the system of how you operate your life, as opposed to a conscious, thriving, interactive, being that you're in deep relationship with and have to be conscientious of.
Right. Yes. And I think, sort of coming off of that as a way or a means to kind of wind us down, the scripture verse that I thought of in light of this passage may seem initially an odd one, but I'll cite it and then I'll express why I thought about it for this. It's 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 19 through 20. It says, "Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit, who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies." Now, that may seem initially sort of an odd scripture, like, wow, Re-Animator, really? You're talking about you are not your own, you're bought with a price? I think it is important, and this is why I honed in on this idea in this viewing of the film, honed in on this idea of manipulating an illusion versus navigating through a relationship. And I honed in on this fact of what does it mean to honor God with your bodies? And I think it means, at least on one level, a recognition that we are more than our bodies.
Sure.
I think it means a recognition that we are more than just tissues. I mean, this is a companion film to Frankenstein, and Frankenstein is about someone trying to be God by simply the act of animating life. Patchworking together. We talked at length about it last week. Patchworking together bodies, dead bodies, and animating them and claiming godship by having the capacity to do such a thing. And I think when we talk about honoring God with our bodies and recognizing when it says we are not our own, we were bought with a price, of course, that is, from a theological perspective, that is talking about Christ on the cross. That is talking about, Paul is writing, referring to Christ's sort of payment of our penalties for sin. I'm not trying to dismiss all of those things, but in a very specific way, trying to articulate that we are more than, we are flesh and blood and bone and sinew and nerves and tissue, but we are more than that. Every single human being on the planet is more than that. Everybody is. And that means, ladies and gentlemen, yeah, you thought you were going to get out of this without a political conversation, but it's just brief. That means, ladies and gentlemen, that the other, whoever the other is for you, that means that if you're on one side and the other is someone from another country, or the other is someone who's a little frightening because maybe they look like a terrorist, or maybe they are a terrorist, they are the other to you. However, there are some people for whom the other may be your hard pressed evangelical neighbor down the street. There are some for whom the other may be our current president. There are some for who the other may be whatever it is that you see in the other that you despise or that you just absolutely abhor. I would urge you, please, as a believer and a follower of Jesus Christ, I would urge you to see them as more than just the surface. See them as more than just flesh and blood and bone and tissue. See them as what they are, which is, whether we like it or not, each and every one of them are fearfully and wonderfully made. They are not their own, just as you are not your own. And if we are to honor God in our bodies, if we are to honor God in our lives, we must at some point come to grips with the fact that the other is as valuable to the Lord as we may be. And it is vital for us to grab hold of that. And when I say the other, I do sincerely mean whoever you are, there is an other that you need to be attentive to in this. And you may feel as if you've got a handle on what the Lord wants for his people or what the Lord wants for your neighbor. But the fact is, if we want to honor God with our bodies, remember that in the Good Samaritan story, Jesus did not describe neighborliness in trends of genetics or of location. It was an act. It was how you treat this other person. That was what being neighborly meant in Christ's story of the Good Samaritan. And if we are to honor God in our bodies, in ourselves, in our lives, we have to acknowledge that in the other.
Well, and I'm going to take your Good Samaritan reference one step further, my friend, and say, I think the Good Samaritan is an interesting story these days because it gets used as, oh, well, shouldn't, and I'm using very specific topical context, but shouldn't America be a Good Samaritan? Shouldn't we help other people who are downtrodden and stuck in the ditch? But what's fascinating about the Good Samaritan story is what were Samaritans? They were the looked down upon. They were the other. And so what that means and how Jesus tells this story is you are the person in the ditch. The other is the one helping you. And it's all about, it's the notion of mercy. Like your capacity to receive aid from the other is indicative of your capacity to be one who will ultimately give aid. I don't know if that makes any sense whatsoever, but I'm just trying to say, like, your point is valid and profound, that we aren't just bodies in motion. And we aren't just white bodies in motion. We aren't just male white bodies in motion. We are a kingdom, a transcendent kingdom, a multinational, multiracial, transcendent kingdom. And we would do well to recognize that to ignore that is to create Frankensteins, is to animate just nothingness.
Yes.
And that is definitely not what we are called to be a part of.
Yeah. Amen to that. And I think if that's okay with you, I think that's a good place to sort of stop on it. So everyone there, just stop manipulating other people.
Yes.
Just stop it. I do know that this is a film that potentially has a lot of thought-provoking opinions about it. We would love to hear each and every one of them. So if you have anything that you'd like to add to this conversation, you can do so in a variety of ways. You can reach out to us. Probably the easiest way is on Twitter. And Nathan, what is our Twitter handle again?
At the Fear of God.
You can also like us on Facebook and post a message or a link there if you so desire. You could also reach out to us by email, fearofgodpodcast@gmail.com. It's all one word, fearofgodpodcast@gmail.com. You could go to morethanonelesson.com and leave a comment on the actual posting there if you so desire. You can also reach out to me personally on Twitter @ReedLackey. And Nathan, where can they find you on Twitter besides the Fear of God?
At the Nathan Rouse. And
we would love to hear from you in any and all degree. Please, 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 if you have a moment and have not already done so, or even if you have done so, just haven't in a while, leave us a review on iTunes if you're enjoying these conversations, if you like some of the things we're scratching at, or even if you don't, just be kind. Be kind, be smart, be loving. But we would love to hear from you in any and all capacity. And Nathan, I sincerely, first of all, I apologize for making you watch Re-Animator. Second of all, I thank you for watching it, and I thank you very much for having this conversation with me.
Sounds good. Just next episode, we're gonna do the 80s feature film version of Care Bears.
Just to balance and offset it.
Right.
I totally understand, and I deserve that. But yes, thank you so much, listeners, and we will check out social media to see where we're heading next week, and we will see you then.
Bye-bye.